after having covered the major moves at black's disposal on move 2, we're now moving on to slightly less common moves. Those include g6, which will be the topic of this video, knight f6, and a6. g6 is a move that is pretty much only used by players who are familiar with accelerated dragon for black, which is a very solid opening and actually is sort of signified by the structure that we've been studying in several of our lines, the Maroczy structure. Although the character over here is a little different, as we still see that the bishops are on, and over here black has quite a lot of lines at its disposal. One line that I used to play a lot as black many years ago was the move knight to g4 over here, and this already sort of shows that there are some lines in this variation which do not really resemble the types of positions we studied, even though it is in itself a Maroczy structure. So 3c4 is definitely a move that I would recommend people to study if they're interested, but I think there's a lot easier solution to this problem of g6. One thing I would like to note is that if you want to go for the main lines, do not go for d4 first, because after c takes d4, knight takes d4, most players will probably play knight c6 or bishop g7 against you, leading to the same positions. But there are some players who are also familiar with the Sicilian dragon, which they can now force by playing knight to f6, knight c3, and d6. So knight f6 is a move that not so many people know about. Obviously, it's pretty much forcing knight to c3, because after e5, queen a5 check, we see that we're losing a pawn, which is a typical trick. However, in this video, I'm going to be looking at a different line, which is d4, c takes d4, queen takes d4. And I think this is a line that recently got a little bit of attention from people, because it seems to be a fairly easy solution to a line that is traditionally quite complicated for white to play against and to study. So the idea is quite simple. Obviously, one take the rook on a h8, and black is more or less forced to play knight f6. Now, e5 is an interesting move over here, but in my opinion, after knight c6, queen to a4, knight d5, queen to e4, knight to b6, black is sort of doing all right by later sacrificing his central pawn for some active play. So this is a line worth studying, but I think the better move here for white is to play knight to c3. So knight to c3 is clearly threatening e5 now, because if black, for example, were to go bishop to g7, he no longer has this option of playing knight to d5 over here, nor knight g4. So this would be quite unpleasant. And therefore black usually plays the move knight to c6 here immediately. Here we also go for queen a4. And at this point black has two major options. He can go bishop to g7, which I think is dubious, actually leads to the same position we just looked at, and black is forced to play knight to g8. And I'll give a couple of moves over here, but I think the line is quite straightforward, and at this point not many black players dare to go for this anymore. So f6 has to more or less be played over here to free up the piece play in the center for black, because it's hard to develop otherwise. We should take on f6 and play long castle, followed by bishop to b5. And maybe positionally it's not the nicest thing to take on c6, but we're really just playing for the fact that we're highly developed, and I think that black cannot really get out of this without doing certain concessions. So for example a6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, rook e1. Positionally it looks quite sound for black, but already here it's hard to move a piece without giving up some sort of vital square. For example, e6, knight d5 seems to be a nice idea, but it would immediately allow bishop to d6, which then in its turn looks quite unpleasant. So a5 has been tried over here to gain a little bit of space on the queen side and maybe create a square on a6 for the bishop. Here I like to give check and bishop to g3, and we're preparing for ideas with knight to e5 over here. And yeah, once again, I think this is quite a good position. Bishop to a6 can be answered with queen h4, and as we can see, knight g5, knight e6 is a very dangerous idea in this position. So bishop to g7 honestly is not a move I have a very high opinion of, and I think that white is doing much better after it. Instead, d6 should be played, and after d6, e5, white's idea of specifically putting the queen on a4 becomes kind of apparent. Black pretty much has to take on e5, and after knight takes e5, here black has three major options. The main line is pretty much bishop to d7, as it's the most easy way to face the problem. but it does give up the bishop without too much in return, in my opinion. So black kind of concedes to play a slightly worse position after this. More ambitious is the move bishop to g7, but first of all I would like to look at the more tactical move queen to d4. Queen to d4 actually is considered to be quite a good move by some players, but after having looked at it myself a little bit more, I'm not very impressed. I think black gets pretty uncomfortable endgames over here. And I like the move b3 here, aiming to develop the bishop to b2. Now one game here continued bishop to f5, which looks quite strong because it gains a tempo against the c2 pawn. But over here white can actually use the fact that now another square for his bishop was opened up, which is bishop to a6, and also threatening to win a perhaps even more relevant pawn. Rook to d8 was played over here, and I think after bishop to b7, rook d6, short castle, white actually has quite a strong initiative with bishop to f4 coming next. The rook's coming out very quickly, and this is not a very good position at all for black. So bishop to f5, even though it's active, allows bishop a6, which is just a very annoying move for black to deal with. So instead bishop to g7 would be the logical way, bishop to b2, and now bishop f5 makes a little bit more sense because black can already castle. And here I think long castle is sort of the way for white to go. And as we can see, I think the endgame already looks quite pleasant for white, who has a nice square on c5. Clearly these pawns are a little bit weak. The only thing white really has to worry about is some counterplay related to knight e4 and knight g4, which therefore I suggest you stop by playing f3. Bishop to d3 is another option, but it does allow some knight e4 and knight g4 moves, so f3 is a little bit more convenient in that sense. And after rook d8, bishop e2, I understand it might not be the most exciting advantage ever, but I really don't see much point for black to go for this position. Next on, white can think about kicking back this bishop by g4 and putting the knight to c5. And once again, I just think this is very pleasant for white. Another idea could be bishop a6, bishop b7 in some positions again, but black is very restricted over here, and yeah, I think this is just a pleasant endgame that nobody would really like to play as black. So queen d4, it leads to slightly uncomfortable positions, and I actually think that b3 is just one of the many options over here. I know bishop to e2 has been tried by several strong players, so here it's really a matter of take your pick as white, what type of advantage you like most, but it's not something that is gonna solve the problems for black in the long run. So after knight takes e5, the other move would be bishop to g7, which in my opinion is a lot more important because black is actually aiming to just give up the c-pawn and play for activity. Bishop to b5 is the right move here, and after short castle taking on c6 we reach the following position. Now this is clearly a position in which we have to know a little bit about what's going on, because if black manages to get active counterplay, he might very well be able to create enough pressure against either the b or the c pawn in the long run to equalize. Luckily there's a game over here by Arkady Nadic that we can follow, who pretty much showed the right way for white to play. Queen c7 is the most popular move here for black, and then rook to e1 threatening bishop to f4, using this using the fact that the queen and the rook are lined up on one diagonal, and also stopping e5 as a defense. Over here bishop to b7 has been played. Rook b6 is also possible, but it runs into knight d5, simplifying the position. And after takes, I don't think black can take on b2, because after bishop takes b2 takes, the rook is pretty much trapped, and this does not look very pleasant for black either. So rook to b6 allows a simplification, and if this does not work, then white will be able to play c3 and bishop to b3 and really consolidate that extra pawn advantage. So this is not something too great for black. Instead, bishop to b7 is a decent move. Obviously now bishop f4 runs into queen takes d6, so we have to take on b7. And after rook takes b7, bishop to f4, we now are at a crossroads for black. First of all, he could initiate a queen trade by playing queen to d7, but I do not think it's really equalizing, because over here rook takes d7 would simply take out the pressure from our pawns on b2 and c2. So we could go rook to d1, for example, or bishop to e5 next. This just looks quite pleasant for white. And knight takes d7 obviously allows this move. Rook takes e7. So even though sometimes a queen trade could be good here if black manages to really set up proper counterplay and get his other rook in, here there's just not enough time. Specifically here, after rook takes b2, rook to b1 is very precise. As after rook takes c2, rook takes d7, we see that we will be winning the pawn here on a7. Although there's a little trick to keep in mind here. After bishop takes c3, of course rook takes a7 would run into bishop to d4 and he will get counterplay on f2. But actually the move rook to c7 seems to me like a very unpleasant position for black to face, because there's almost no way out of this pin besides the move rook b2. And I think that this position is probably close to lost for black already. So this is definitely not something that could be called a real solution for black. Moving back to the initial game I referred to, after bishop to b7 takes bishop f4, queen to c5 was played in the game Neidic against Hausrath in 2011 in Germany. And here Neidic actually played very precise, so it's a game to follow. Rook to e5, forcing pretty much a queen trade. And after takes, he played the move bishop to c1, which is not a very nice move in itself, but with the rook swinging over to the a file and putting pressure on the a pawn, and of course e7 is hanging right now, it seems to me that it's more than sufficient to keep the advantage. So e6 was played over here, rook to a5, rook to d8, initiating some tricks with knight e4 and back rank mates. So Neidic played king to f1, a nice move bringing in the king. Rook to d7, defending the a7 pawn, and after king e2, Hausrath played knight d5, which was definitely an error, because after the following moves, takes, c3, and bishop e3, white was just a clear pawn up and went on to win the game shortly after. Instead, the move knight e4 might strike you as more annoying to face, but once again, I think with precise play, white can hold on to the pawn here and really just have a close to winning position. Knight to d1 specifically is very precise here, and this is another idea you want to keep in mind here. If you can get to play c3 and of course retain your pawn on b2, then you're really taking out the biggest pressure, which comes from the bishop on g7. So in this case, c3 would be next, and then probably rerouting the knight to e3 and finding a more active spot. But as long as white can hold on to his pawns here and then slowly but surely bring his pieces out, I think there's no doubt that white is much better. So this is really it for the tricky line with the move bishop to g7, which is giving up a pawn once again. It's something you have to know about in order to play this line, so definitely study it. But like I said, I don't think it's enough for equality, and definitely a little bit depressing from black's side to go for that if white is aware of how to retain his pawn advantage. So that leads us to bishop to d7, which is really the main line. And after knight takes d7, queen takes d7, bishop to e3, we already see the type of position that we're sort of getting into. We have the bishop pair. Honestly, black has very little to offer in return for that. But of course he has a solid position, and here the main task for white is really to show how much he can make out of that bishop pair, and of course also a slight advantage in development. So bishop to g7, rook d1 is my suggestion. Here black has several moves. First of all, queen to c7 will be followed by g3, and the main idea is that there's now no knight g4 ideas here. So bishop to g2, short castle, this would really already give white a very pleasant position. It kind of resembles some sort of Catalan structure, but there's hardly any counterplay over here, and no real way to ever block this bishop's scope. So this is not something that's very commonly played. Instead, queen to c8 is probably a better move, because it allows g3 and knight g4, which is now a little bit annoying because it also introduces ideas of bishop takes c3 and maybe queen e6 check if we remove our bishop from e3. So instead after queen to c8, it's actually better to just play bishop to e2. And after castle, a6, rook to e1. We're not playing spectacular moves, just developing our pieces. b5, queen h4, I think that this position is just a little bit better. Specifically, queen to f5 was played in one of the games here of Adiban, if I'm not mistaken. And here I think white went for rook d2 or something like that, which probably granted him some small advantage. But instead the computer points out that after g4, white's actually much better, intending to go g5 and just gain over a lot of space. Black pretty much has to retreat because queen takes c2 would be followed by rook to d2. And the queen is trapped. After queen c8, g5, knight d7, bishop f3, followed by a well-timed knight to d5. This looks very pleasant for white. And note that this idea bishop f3, bishop g2 is quite important here, because obviously you cannot just go g4, g5 and not think about your king after that, but by putting the bishop back to g2, not only do we improve its positioning, it's also guarding our king very well from that square. So that's a nice little improvement over some of the games that were played over here. I think the most interesting move for black here is to go queen to g4. Once again, black would like to initiate some sort of trade where he gets active play against our knight specifically. For example, bishop to c1, bishop takes c3. I'm not entirely sure how much our bishop pair is worth with this structural damage done over here. So I would not go for the queen trade. Instead, I would go queen to b3, attacking b7. And here, short castle. Again, queen takes b7 might be possible, but I would like to keep it simple. I believe knight to b4 can be played now, and things get a little bit messy. So instead, I just suggest you go for h3, kicking out the queen, and thereby allowing yourself to naturally develop with bishop to e2 next. Queen to c8 is mostly played here. Queen to b4 can be played, but I just don't see any reason why this position wouldn't be a bit better for white. Specifically after knight to b4, rook d2, we can swing over the king to c1 and then bring our other rook in. And yeah, this is really not a very worrisome position. Also note that bishop to f3, of course, will be played again, stopping most of the active ideas here related to knight d5. So one of those stable advantages that you should be happy with as white here. Instead, after h3, queen to c8 is the move that I think should be played. And like I said, we're developing naturally over here. A6, short castle. b5 is a bit premature over here. I just don't really see what black can do after a4. After b4, knight to d5, it looks like this is more of a weakness than anything else. And knight to a5 can be answered with queen to b4. And of course, taking on a4 is not really great at any point either. And over here, knight c6, queen h4. It resembles the type of position we were looking at earlier. Note that here specifically there's a little tactic working in our favor. If black tries to win the pawn on b2, we have this idea of playing bishop to f3 and then taking on a8. So also that does not work. Instead of the move b5, I think black should try to stay solid by all means and play the move e6. Here I like knight a4, using the hole on b6 that was created because of the move a6. And after the following moves, again c3. Also, when we're not a pawn up, I think this move c3 is just very nice because it's blocking the scope of the opponent's bishop. And next on, white should be thinking about improving his bishop's position. Specifically, I like maneuvers like g3, bishop f3, bishop g2 here. And really, as long as you keep the bishop pair over here, this is going to be a very tough position for black to defend. So this is definitely, yeah, once again, just a very good outcome for the opening. And again, it's a line where I think you have to know relatively little theory and you can really get good positions. Right now, I don't know what the exact solution is for black against queen takes d4. I've not yet got a chance to play it myself, but I might very well try it after looking deeper into this. So I hope you enjoyed this recommendation, which really now finishes your repertoire against any accelerated dragon players. We've got a repertoire against both knight c6 over here, and g6. So you're covered against those players. Next on, we're going to look at slightly more goofy lines like knight to f6 and the O'Kelly variation with a6. And that's it. That will be your Sicilian repertoire. So I hope you're enjoying the ride so far, and we'll have 2 more videos to go. Thank you for watching.